Welcome back to Shabbat Made Simple. Today we're going to learn 5 melachot, 5 steps in the process of creating shelter, going from God's wonderful creation to our basic needs, and today specifically shelter. Obviously it doesn't have to be as beautiful as Buckingham Palace, but the concept and the principles remain the same, whether it's the simplest shelter in the world or this beautiful one you see in front of you. There are 5 basic steps to go from God's creation. For example, although not limited to, these rocks over here on the left, and creating from them this shelter or this home on the right. As a matter of fact, in the olden days, this would be very, very typical of what a house might look like. Not necessarily with all the complex parts that our modern-day houses have, but just simply piling a bunch of rocks on top of each other in order to use it for shelter. The first of these processes, going from the rocks to the house, is what we refer to as building. This is the melacha of building, the melacha of creating shelter for ourselves and for our needs. Now, similar to building would be making a tent, for example. So even though the tent was already made before, and all you're doing is picking up the tent or making it usable, that would be considered similar to building, and therefore would be considered a melacha, one of the prohibited actions on Shabbat. Also similar, according to most opinions, though you might not think of being similar, would be opening an umbrella. Because think about it, an umbrella acts as shelter for you, and it allows you to be protected from rain, from the elements outside. Now, in addition to building, would be the second melacha, and that would be taking the building apart. Oftentimes this was necessary to move it from one place to another, or taking things apart in order to use them again in the process of building. That would be considered a melacha as well. And this we refer to as dismantling. Obviously, taking a sledgehammer and smashing this into pieces would not be considered dismantling. That would be considered destroying. And something that's destroying just for the sake of destroying is not necessarily a melacha. Only when it is taking it apart in order to build from it, then is it considered a melacha. Then it's considered a creative process instead of a destructive process. Similar to dismantling would be closing this umbrella. So let's pretend that you had the umbrella open before Shabbat. Maybe you can make the argument that you can use it on Shabbat, although most opinions say that you cannot and you should not for different reasons. But closing this umbrella would be similar to dismantling, because the reason you're closing it is in order to open it again. There are many other examples. I'm just choosing this as one very practical and common example. Now, in the olden days when they would build things, oftentimes when they would have to take them apart and put them back together, they would make markings on the objects. If you look very closely at all the areas that are circled, you'll see that there are numbers or markings that are put into place to let them know how to put these beams back together again. From this, we learn the third melacha, and that is the melacha of writing. Anytime you write, even if it's not for the purposes of creation, not for the purposes of building, it is prohibited on Shabbat. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. So, for example, as long as you write any 2 letters, in Hebrew, let's say the word letter Aleph, and then the letter Bet, that makes the word Av, which means father. Anytime you write any 2 letters on Shabbat, that is considered writing, that is considered a biblical, a Torah prohibition, and therefore it is considered a melacha. Similar to writing, even though you might not think it's a permanent writing, would be writing in the sand, or writing on a frosted window when it's cold outside. So even though the writing is going to erase very quickly, and therefore it's not permanent, it's still not allowed to be done on Shabbat. In addition to writing, we have the fourth melacha, which would be erasing. Just as you're not allowed to write on Shabbat, You're not allowed to erase on Shabbat. And again, here's another application, another thing which is similar that you might not think of, and that would be cutting a cake that has writing on it. Because as soon as you cut the word into half, you've essentially erased it. So therefore, we have to be careful not to have birthday cakes on Shabbat that have words on them, and if they do, the words should be removable without erasing them. It's also true of opening a package on Shabbat. Even though maybe you're allowed to open it under certain circumstances, for example, for eating food, however, you have to be very careful not to tear words or letters that are written on those packages. And the fifth malacha leads us to one of the most practical aspects of Shabbat, which is a very complicated malacha, and we call it the final hammer blow. Similar to the final hammer blow, strangely enough, might be putting on a light switch. Although there are other problems with putting on a light switch. For example, we're going to learn this in another class, that when you put on a light, you create heat, and you turn on a filament, which is the part of the light that lights up, which creates heat, which would be similar to lighting a fire. We're going to learn about that later. But even in a circumstance where there is no fire and there is no heat, nonetheless, putting on a light switch completes the circuit. It's similar to the final hammer blow. In the olden days, when they would make an object, for example, out of silver, if they wanted to make a silver cup for Kiddush, a silver becher, a silver Kiddush cup, they would first make the cup, then they would put all the decorations on, and there would still be some little details that had to be fixed in order for it to be complete. And those little details are referred to as the final hammer blow. And this would also be true in building a shelter, that when you would put the shelter together, there still were the little touches that made it just right so that the wind wouldn't come in, etc., etc. And this is referred to as the final hammer blow. We're not going to discuss it more in detail now, but it really is very complicated how to apply this. But let's just say the most important application may be not putting on a light switch or anything with electricity, including computer games, etc., etc. And so we have 5 steps of building shelter. Number 1 is building. Number 2 was dismantling. Number 3 was writing. Number 4 was erasing. And number 5, the most complex, the most complicated of them all, was the final hammer blow. And that concludes this portion of making Shabbat simple. Thank you very much for listening, and wishing you and all of those you love a Shabbat Shalom.